Thanks so much, Jeff, and our sponsors. I again want to compliment you at the highest for putting this symposium on at this critical time in our history, where people are struggling both individually and collectively with dealing with the despair that so many of us are feeling. So when we talk about awe, we often think of rarefied moments, and a number of the speakers have brought these up. A beautiful sunset, a walk through the woods, the sparkle of the rain coming down, or even the birth of a baby. And these are all wonderful scenes, and certainly bring a great deal of exhilaration to us on many levels, physical and emotional. But I want to contend that there's a whole other side of awe that is really important to focus on, and that's been a lot of my work. And I want to illustrate that just in this moment, because I'm sure you're observing that we are having a conversation over a technical device that's sitting on a table, that is resting on a floor. But I contend that there's a whole lot more going on right now. And the way I'd put it is we're having a conversation over a technical device that's sitting on a table, that's resting on a floor, that's anchored to a ball that is whirling around the sun at 67,000 miles per hour, that is nested in a galaxy that is moving through the universe at 1.3 million miles per hour to a destination that is completely unknown, at least to many of us, from an origin that is completely unknown. So that's my way of bringing us around to the fact that awe, or the sense of awe, is pervasive. It's right here, it's right now. And the whole question is, how do we cultivate it? How can we connect with the possibilities of the groundlessness of our existence that's all around us? Not only the terrors. And so this was a lot of what I researched in my book, Awakening to Awe, Personal Stories of Profound Transformation, where I studied in depth. I brought a qualitative framework to this research. We've talked a lot about quantitative. I think the qualitative is extremely important because it can go more in depth into people's intimate experiences of awe. And I looked at participants' experiences of how the sense of awe transformed their lives, and looked at them in naturalistic settings. It was a naturalistic study. And awe as a lifetime cultivation. So these are some of the themes that came up in this work. I'll go to the next slide. So at the base of cultivating a sense of awe, a deeper sense of awe, is this theme of presence. Taking time to reflect. And what I mean by presence is a heightened awareness of one's whole body experience in the given moment. This presence then often involves a capacity to slow down, a capacity to savor the moment, a focus on what one loves. And I'm hoping that you're seeing as we're going along here how each of these themes relate to that basic connection that many of us have been talking about and that I just brought out in terms of the cosmic connection to the bigger picture of living, the amazement of living, the gift of living. So capacity to see the bigger picture and openness to the mystery of life, again, this groundlessness, which is continually evolving, and a point of curiosity, if one can get into it, be present to it, an appreciation for the fact of life, the astonishment that we're just here, an appreciation of pain as a sometimes teacher, and perhaps anxiety, some apprehension has not been brought up that explicitly so far in this meeting. And I would like to emphasize that for many people, especially for a long-term or a lifelong cultivation of awe, one needs to be able to encounter one's anxiety to some degree, some discomfort. This is part of the fuller, more zestful awe experience for many people. And it gives it a depth and a poignancy that just the wonder part, or the sense of unity, may not bring. Being able to experience our fragility as well as our boldness goes along with that. Contemplative time alone, contemplative time in nature, which we've talked a lot about, time with close others, in-depth psychotherapy and meditation can certainly be conducive to cultivating these deeper senses of awe. An ability to trust the evolving nature of conflict, that this too shall pass. In other words, to be able to be present to the unsettlement of connecting to the bigger picture, the vastness, and to recognize that one can feel one's participation in something greater and transcend the so often pounding judgments that we put on ourselves, our narrow identifications. Ability to trust the evolving nature of life, to give oneself over discerningly to the unknowable, an ability to trust the ultimately unknowable. That deeper kind of trust in the ultimately unknowable, I call faith in the inscrutable. Faith in the inscrutable. Can one get to a place where you can have that faith? And just quickly, this reminds me of one of the great deathbed reflections that conjured a sense of awe, and that is Ernest Becker, who's one of the major researchers of death and dying, wrote a classic work called The Denial of Death, and he tragically died at a very young age. He was dying of cancer at 49, and he was asked by a reporter, well, can you reflect to us on your own dying experience? And he said something to the effect that I take solace in giving myself over to the tremendous creative energies of the cosmos to be used for purposes we don't know. And even if we feel misused at times, this is still one of the most exhilarating experiences a person can have. And to me, that is a tremendously inspiring way to deal with, to connect with one's dying. So speaking of exemplars, of people who are able to tap into a sense of awe in the most difficult conditions, and I'm hoping that this really relates to many of you out there who are first responders, police officers, mental health workers. I mean, we immerse ourselves in, the trying and depraved conditions of life all the time. And naturally, we're going to be asking questions. Well, how do you tap in to that bigger picture in these situations? Well, here are people who set the bar for that. Viktor Frankel, in his classic work, Man's Search for Meaning, talks about his death camp, Nazi death camp experience. And I certainly don't want to romanticize this, but Frankel was able to find a way to tap into his imagination to connect with the bigger picture. And what he pictured was the radiance of his wife's smile that meant everything for him in even a few moments. And it's something he could go back into. He had that inner freedom to tap into that picture and helped him in these most depraved circumstances of the death camp. Stephen Hawking, connecting with the cosmos in the face of one of the most crippling diseases, ALS, having the courage to go beyond the narrow and crippling identification. Maya Angelou, who was able to connect with a sense of awe after being raped as a 7-year-old girl. And she found it in great works of literature in the library, reading people that inspired her to see the more of life, more possibilities that she could bring into her own life. And as you know, became a poet and a great writer. So again, how do we tap into a constructive as opposed to defensive position toward the more of existence? And presence is at the base of that, cultivating that heightened awareness of one's whole body experience, that meditative practices and depth therapy in particular can help. But there are other ways that we can cultivate this. And one of the most important applications of the sense of awe or humility and wonder, sense of adventure toward living that I've found recently is my work with a grassroots movement called Braver Angels. They have some 10,000 members now across the country. They bring self-identified liberals and conservatives together for living room style conversations to address the cultural and political divides that these people are so stuck in. And these have been amazing and transformational meetings. And I've synthesized that work as a moderator for that group into what I call the Experiential Democracy Dialogue. I know I have to wind up soon, which is in my book, The Depolarizing of America. It lays all of this out in a lot of detail. I have a 6-phase model of helping people with very different backgrounds just learn to sit with one another, be present to one another, so that they can learn about and understand one another, as opposed to presume, or what so often happens in our society, belittle one another. And a couple of the phases that I think are particularly relevant to cultivating this sense of awe, and I realize it's just a taste of it, but is this mindful visualization before people even enter in to the dialogue about racism or politics. I just invite them to envision what it would be like to sit with that person in that dialogue. What are the thoughts, feelings, body sensations that come up, and try to observe them like a river, mindfully, without getting stuck on any one point. And similarly, to clear a space for the human being with a personal story like you, who's before you, rather than just getting caught up in that person as a label or a stereotype. And then second phase, sharing their backgrounds, their context, where are they coming from as human beings? So important before you enter into dialogues like this. What was it like for them to grow up? Get more of a sense of their lived experience, and how did their family system treat the other, whoever the other is, in terms of the dialogue they're about to have, again, regarding race or culture or religion. There are other phases, as you see here, but the culminating phase is to see what we've learned, what the partners have learned through the dialogue, hopefully the humanizing dialogue, and seeing if there is a place for real common ground. And the studies have shown, and my experience has shown, that people find quite a bit of common ground, and not necessarily around policy, but around being able to coexist with one another and even have a friendly and warm connection with one another, which is huge. That's a huge step for our society, as many of you know. And I think it can apply, these group formats or one-on-one formats can apply to some of the settings you're all involved in. And I refer you to the Experiential Democracy Project, which involved a a Black community Black community activist, and a white police officer in the Experiential Democracy Dialogue, an older version. And perhaps it'll be helpful for some of you in your work in sensitizing people to the humanity of people you work with in the community. So with that, I thank you so much and look forward to our further discussion here.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I mean, this is a wonderful event. I wish there were more like it. It's rare that I get the opportunity to speak outside the academic bubble, so I really am pleased that you invited me, and I hope to live up to Jeff's expectations here. Let me start my slideshow. So I'd like to start with a quote that I think captures the spirit of my talk here quite well. This is a quote from Charles Kingsley, who's sort of a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He wrote, "When I walk the fields, I am oppressed now and then with an innate feeling that everything I see has meaning, if I could but understand it. And this feeling of being surrounded by truths I cannot grasp amounts to indescribable awe." So there seems to be something about this emotional state that is wrapped up with wanting to understand the world around you, but feeling like you can't quite wrap your head around it. Something is happening that defies your everyday way of explaining and understanding the world. And as you've probably heard over the rest of the talks that you've been to today, this fits nicely with the psychological definition of awe, how researchers have thought about what happens when you experience this state. Specifically, it's thought to be evoked when you are in the presence of something vast, not just physically vast. This could be an idea. This could be a piece of music. This could be it could be something physical. You're in the presence of something so large that you have a hard time wrapping your head around it. And the second ingredient, one that I'll focus most of my talk on today, this feeling of vastness triggers a need for what's called accommodation. You have to change your way of thinking about the world in order to make sense of what's in front of you. Okay. Now, you've heard a lot about the awe as a positive emotional experience, but it's also the case that feeling like you can't understand the world around you, being in the presence of, or being in a situation where you are ill-equipped to make sense of what's going on, that is not necessarily a positive feeling. It can lead to confusion, disorientation, and a general feeling of uncertainty. This is an aversive, or can be at least, an aversive state. I often feel averse when I look around and I fail to make sense of what's going on. The idea here that I'd like to suggest to you all is that when we are in such a state, we gravitate towards beliefs, towards explanations, towards understandings that provide us with a sense that the world is an ordered place, that the world is not random or chaotic, that there's some kind of pattern or meaning that underlies it. And that this desire to find order that awe evokes leads us towards certain kinds of explanations for what's going on. You can think of awe as kind of like, at least in my view, a spark that ignites a search for explanations. Now, these explanations, they don't always have to be related to the truth. They can just be explanations that satisfy this desire to find order. And so my research program is really interested in understanding what kinds of explanations do people gravitate towards when they're feeling awe and when when they're experiencing this need to see order or to find order and meaning in the world around them. So in general, I've focused on two kinds of explanations that people might gravitate towards. My research has looked at what happens when you make people feel awe, and then give them either what I'll call supernatural explanations for the world or scientific explanations for the world. Does awe increase supernatural explanations? Does it decrease them? Same for scientific ones. If you don't recognize the turtleneck here, this is Carl Sagan. He's my avatar for a scientific god. I'll just be using him moving forward. So I'll give you three takeaways from some of my research associated with this question of what happens when you feel awe and how it might impact supernatural versus scientific explanations. The first is that awe seems to increase belief in religion as an explanatory framework if you are religious. If you are already someone who subscribes to religious beliefs, and then I take you into my laboratory and I make you feel some amount of awe, now you report experiencing even more belief in religion as a way of explaining the world around you. So that's number one. Number two, awe significantly reduces theists' belief in science as an explanatory framework. So if you're a religious person, I take you into my lab, I make you experience awe. Not only is it the case that you increase your belief in religion as a way of explaining the world around you, you decrease your belief in science as a way of explaining the world around you. And then third, this one's a little bit fuzzier, at least in my data. If you're not a religious individual, if you don't subscribe to any particular religious belief system, and then I bring you to my lab and I make you feel awe, this does not increase your belief in religion. And it sometimes, depending on how I ask the question, increases your belief in science as a way of explaining the world around you. So in short, what I've found across several studies is that awe nudges us towards believing even more in the explanations for the world that we already believe in. If you come into the lab already believing in religion as an explanation for the world, now you're going to believe in it even more if I make you feel awe. And if you are not so disposed, if you don't believe in any kind of religious explanation for the world, now you get nudged a little bit more towards scientific explanations when you're feeling awe. So this might seem a little contradictory or inconsistent with the idea of awe as creating openness, as awe as fundamentally related to humility. After all, if it's nudging you towards believing even more in what you already believe, sort of getting you to double down on your particular ideology, that doesn't seem very open. It seems, in fact, the opposite of open. And as Kirk was talking, you know, I thought this tension between openness and retreating to an existing belief system mapped on quite nicely to what he was calling constructive versus defensive positions. It seems like under some circumstances, in some context, perhaps for some people, awe creates a defensive position where it nudges us back towards our existing beliefs, what's comfortable, what's familiar, what we rely upon in our everyday lives to understand what's going on around us. But in other contexts, perhaps for other people, awe creates this constructive position, this more open, more humble, more curious position. And so the question then becomes, how do we how do we nudge people towards the constructive position and away from the defensive position? If the open, the humble, the curious profile is the psychologically healthier one, then we might want to understand the contexts in which the opposite seems to be happening, for whom that might happen, and how we can move folks away from either those dispositions or those contexts and towards a more constructive conception of the awe experience. So one area of research that I'm really interested in is playing around with the contexts that people are in when they experience awe, and seeing how that influences either their constructive, I'll use that language now, either their constructive or defensive position. If you're in a threatening environment, if the elicitor of awe is a threatening elicitor, well, you're probably going to retreat to your defensive stance. You'll default back to your way of explaining the world, the one that you know and you're familiar with. But if you feel that you're in a safe environment, well, then these might be the conditions where awe leads to that more constructive stance. And similarly, there are personality traits, like how open you are to experience, how tolerant you are for ambiguity or uncertainty, that might also play a role here. Again, for certain kinds of people, that more open, more curious response to awe just might be more prone towards that kind of response than others. So one implication of this idea to many of the folks in our audience today, what I'll call awe on the front lines, is that the context in which you work, you find yourself professionally, tends to be a threatening one. Tends to be one where, for some reason, the world might seem chaotic, random, or like something bad's about to happen. And furthermore, a context where the bad things that happen, the reasons aren't always so clear. This seems to me the kind of context that could create this defensive stance, where if you were to experience awe, you might not get those positive benefits that you've been hearing about today, the ones that build resilience, etc. And that, to me, makes it all the more important that when outside that professional context, when outside that context that nudges you towards the defensive position, you try to counter it with awe experiences that promote a more constructive approach. If you live a lot of your life in contexts that nudge you towards doubling down on your beliefs, one way to make, or at least try to temper the spread of that mentality to other areas of life, is to actively work on fostering the kinds of positive awe experiences, the more constructive awe experiences that you've been hearing about today. That is what I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for hosting this. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this. It's really great to, I was able to listen into some of the earlier speakers this morning, and Kirk, it's great to be able to work with you and see you again. My research builds very directly off of Dr. Schneider's research, as he was speaking about earlier, his qualitative research, which he talks about in the book Awakenings, the profound stories of transformation. I and Professor Harris Friedman took that information, we delved into it a little deeper, and also looked at some transcendental literature and things, and we looked for what were some of the elements, the themes that kept coming up in experiences of awe, and that kind of served as the model that then formed the research for when I looked into dispositional awe and spiritual intelligence. Dispositional awe is basically the tendency, the likelihood for people to experience awe. That's the same exact thing can happen. Two different people can see the same exact rainbow or moon coming over the horizon, and one of them can just be blown away in awe, and then the other person can be like, oh yeah, I guess it's the moon. What's the difference that makes that difference, and how does that vary in between person and within person over time? Are some of the research areas that I'm interested in, and also in for my research for my dissertation, I looked at the relationship between awe and the tendency to experience awe and spirituality. So the original model that I built, to kind of develop quite a series of questions to tap into what's the likelihood that people will experience awe, was very much built on, as I said, Dr. Schneider's transcriptions of his conversations with people about their experiences of awe. In that model of awe, we kind of found 10 different elements, and we kind of loosely grouped them into 3 different subgroups. The cognitive elements of awe that we found were the 3 groups were cognitive elements, perceptual elements, and emotional elements. And the cognitive elements were existential awareness. So in experiences of awe, people will oftentimes, relate to, a triggering them about thinking about what the meaning of life is and existence and things like that. Ineffable wonder. People will talk about, there's very much a sense of curiosity that's kind of almost beyond words. They want to know more about the experience, whatever it is they're seeing or witnessing, but they also want to go beyond the surface of that. What does it mean? A deeper kind of sense of mystery about the experience. Experiences of awe are very, very oftentimes associated with openness and acceptance. A lot of the research shows that there is a very high correlation between people who score higher measures on openness, for example, and people who tend to report higher frequency experiences of awe, more susceptible to awe, things like that. Also, there is research to show that experiences of awe promote people to being more open and accepting of things, which I think is a real important, implications. And vastness is the other cognitive element, which is, everyone's familiar with. It seems to be the triggering element, and vastness. Oftentimes we think about seeing a huge star field at night, or a tornado, or being able to see far out, tornadoes or things like that. But vastness really can be triggered by just about anything. People can just look into a lawn and look at the all the leaves of grass and contemplate what it's like for all the molecules of moisture and everything in the earth to create that. And the idea of vastness can be found right there in the grain of salt sitting on your desk in front of you. When you think about how interesting that is, that it's a perfect square, and then down on molecular levels it's similar, and just think about how any single thing in your environment can trigger you into a sense of vastness and connectionness with the rest of the universe. Although some things do have the tendency to do that more likely than others, like tornadoes and star fields and things like that. So for the perceptual elements of law in our model, we notice heightened perceptions. Oftentimes when people talked about their experiences of awe, they noticed that things seemed clearer, the color seemed brighter, the lines seemed clearer, they could hear things more distinctly. That their sense of touch was more individuated. They became more heightened about all the 5 different senses, not just so much focused on in experiences of awe. People start to realize wow, that the feeling of my goosebumps or hair on my arms, their whole body becomes more tactily aware, it seems like. the sense of presence. One of the most common things about, descriptions of awe people have is they are not really ever, caught up in what happened yesterday or worried about what may happen tomorrow. During, experiences of awe, people are completely in the moment. And again, we know there is this definite, back and forth relationship where people who have the tendency to get caught up in the future or caught up in the past, they tend to miss out on experiences of being awed, compared to people who are more in the present. But we also know that the relationship works the other way, that when people, regardless of how caught up they tend to be in the past and the future, if they have more experiences of awe, if they become more open to awe or just, cultivate their experiences of awe, the more likely they are to be in the present just in general. And therefore less caught up in the past and the future where anxiety and depression, tend to lurk and live. And for the emotional elements, a sense of profoundness, like that is, the one of the hallmark traits of awe. Awe isn't something that kind of like, yeah, I had a little bit of awe when I experienced that. Like if a person experiences awe, it's like no, that was that the experience itself was profound, and it's kind of like, yeah, it was nice and everything like that. And I was actually a little bit awed. Like, no, if you were awed, it was more than just, it was just a nice kind of experience. It was a significant experience. That's a unifying, element to the experience of awe. Numinous, there's very, almost invariably when people describe experiences of awe, they say there's something about it you can't quite explain. There's something, and they get a sense that that's something about it, it transcends normal reality, normal everyday life, and just a consciousness sense. Or for some people, they're touching something beyond life. For some people, it has a transcendental significance. But for other people, it's more like, no, it's not that everyday experience. It's one of those things that, like, yes, happens every once in a while, and it's, it's significant somehow. Oftentimes there is an element of fear. When you look more at classical descriptions of awe, there definitely is more of this awareness of terror, and often things that, can evoke the idea of being threatening to one's mortality, even though you're safe from it. So the idea of seeing a tornado, but from a safe distance, is, I think, that like a universal elicitor of awe, because it carries with it the threat to completely wipe out your existence, which, forces you to kind of confront the nature of your existence and what happens when your existence can end. Whereas in situations of absolute complete danger, a lot of times people are just like too frightened or on autopilot, until it's over. When people realize, wow, that could kill me, but they're in safe, kind of in the security of not being in an actual, imminent danger, that can evoke, awe, very often. One of the things I think, is salient, and when we consider, the target audience here. I'd like to, talk a little, about the rest of my research, and then I did want to kind of end it on some of the ways I think that some of these issues, some of these kind of elements of awe can relate to first responders and their experience, and hopefully the potential of building a resilience. I'm sorry, and the last emotional element of awe is a sense of connectedness. Very, very frequently when people have experiences of awe, they will talk about how, a part of it is that their realization or consideration of how they are part of something bigger than themselves, connectedness with the universe, with their fellow humanity, or nature in general. The construct that I looked at when doing my dissertational research, so after I used Dr. Schneider's research and built a kind of a big model of awe, I used that to develop a questionnaire to tap into dispositional awe, and looked how that related to a construct known as spiritual intelligence, which is, it can be kind of seen as a person's ability to kind of tap into and benefit experiences of spirituality. And it is kind of apart from a religion. For most people, they do tend to get their spiritual experiences and needs and things met through traditional religious experiences and traditions and things like that. And a lot of measures that are out there do talk about, and they kind of conflate the idea of religious experience and spiritual experience sometimes. And that was one of the reasons I chose this measure, because it intentionally avoids that and really just talks about spirituality in a larger kind of sense that relates to both secular experiences as well as traditional religious experiences of people. Spiritual intelligence is kind of comprised of 4 different areas and has 4 different subscales on the measure that we used. Critical existential thinking, personal meaning production, transcendental awareness, and conscious state expansion. And all the items on this instrument, they really talk about how a person makes use of, or how these areas of experience influence their actual day-to-day life, not just in a belief way. So some of the items might be, I use meditative states to help me deal with stress in appropriate ways and things like that. So the results showed when we looked at the SIS 324, which is the measure of spiritual intelligence, and we looked at it with the items that I developed based on that 10-factor model, or that 10-element model. And also we used Michelle Chioda's subscale from her dispositional positive emotional scales. She has an awe subscale. It's only 5 items, but we use that to validate my measure and also to as a secondary measure. We saw very clearly that spiritual intelligence and the tendency to experience awe are very highly correlated. When I looked at the specific different elements of it, there were some definitely some differences. So getting really down into some of the details. Some of the things correlated much more strongly. For example, the experience of or the tendency to have profound experiences tend to correlate pretty highly, most strongly with the idea of transcendental awareness. So people who reported a tendency to have a lot of major, significant experiences in life tend to also score high in measures on the SIS-3 of having an awareness of things beyond just your normal everyday experience. And then, so the overall finding, most importantly, was there was a very clear, strong relationship between the tendency to experience awe and people's ability to tap into and make benefit use of their spiritual experiences. So some of the ways I thought that this might be important to consider for first responders. One was with their experience of community and fellowship. When I think of first responders, I think of the firefighters and the paramedics and the police, in the communities, being part of neighborhoods, taking care and keeping safe individuals, and also within the ranks of the first responders, the fellowship and camaraderie and that officers and firefighters experience with one another. I think that relates to a lot of issues like connectedness and that sense of being beyond something of yourself. It's not just you. There's thousands of other officers that you kind of connected. And the idea of openness, I think, relates to community. When you think of how many people make up the communities that you guys serve and how those communities are diverse and diversely changing over the years, I think it opens up, connects to the idea of openness. And first responders, by virtue of what you guys do, they are, subject to many extreme situations, things that, many people don't experience, high-speed chases and things like that, fires and burning buildings they experience on a regular basis. And that definitely relates to, the elements of profoundness. And when first responders tend to be in these situations, they will report that their perceptions are very much heightened. They hear things and see things with an acuity that they don't at other times. So and also danger. I think a lot of the situations you guys deal with are dangerous situation, and I think all that kind of really relates to a lot of the fact that you guys deal with death, save lives and see death. it really definitely leads to existential awareness. And you guys, by virtue of what you do, have a tendency to kind of come up and confront a lot of these kinds of issues. And I think one way to kind of deal with that in a constructive way and kind of facilitate resilience is for first responders to think about their purpose and their meaning, what they actually do with themselves, which is, one of the reasons I want to thank you, Jeff, for allowing me to participate in this. I want to say thank you to all the first responders there. My father was a police officer for 25 years in Bayonne, New Jersey. So I think this is a great way to be able to honor his memory and say thank you very much to all you guys who put your lives on the line every day. I do appreciate it very much.
Let's jump in now right away with our expert panelists. And we have Dr. Monica Brooker, we have Dr. Chelsea Harris and Sergeant Aaron McClure. I guess I will throw it to you first, Dr. Monica Brooker, and given what you do as far as in law enforcement, the NYPD, also being a clinical psychologist, in your vast work in equity and inclusion, I'd love to hear what you have to say and maybe a question for one of our researchers.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thank you all for talking about I and all of these different dimensions. I have to say that it has been like an extraordinary year in law enforcement. And while public safety and all of those things are at the forefront, it's also been an experience in vulnerability for individuals within law enforcement. And even beyond that, to Dr. Valdesolo's point, it's been a vulnerability point in terms of order, because so much is pushing in on this job and the environment. And so three things that stood out that really I feel like speaks to the work that we're doing is there is polarization, right? There's polarization with the community in terms of us and them. And then there's also internal polarization about who matters and what matters. And all of those things are pressing in. But then that makes me jump over to the need for safety. And so I really want to turn to you, Dr. Schneider, because I think that space of reflection, that being able to pull out the lens and to see things a little bit more clearly is so critical for us to, be the best that we can be at this job. So if you could talk a little bit more about the dialogues that you had, and if you could speak about what the outcomes were, so we know that there is a pathway for change as we sort of use awe and as we get better at our sort of reflective practice, if you will.
Yes, thank you, Monica. Excellent question. First of all, safety is critical to these dialogues. That's something I didn't have a chance to emphasize, but one of the first things that we immerse people in are the ground rules. And the ground rules are crucial in setting the tone for the dialogues. They have everything to do with safety, support. The ground rules request that people attempt to come from a place of curiosity, really try to tap that sense of wondering about another person or about otherness in general versus presumption. Also, bringing your best self to the situation, your humanity, trying to avoid nonverbal devaluations, which is so easy to do. The big sigh or rolling of the eyes, we say this to people to really try to avoid that. Clear a space for cultivating presence. So the other piece here is that structure is very important. So having structured dialogues helps people to avoid going off the rails, which happens so quickly in these charged, divisive conversations, that people tend to engage in flame throwing very quickly and defensiveness or violence. So what we try to do is, again, to help people to learn to center themselves more, be more present to the otherness in themselves as well as the other through these phases, And before jumping into a dialogue about a very charged issue, again, helping them to immerse in what it may be like to actually see this dialogue partner as a human being and not just a label. And a lot of the exercises or the phases are designed around humanizing the partners. Because we've learned from very hard experience that if you don't have that safety and structure, these dialogues go off the rails very quickly.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Great question. And thank you for your insight, Kirk. Let's jump in next to, because again, we remember this isn't just about police and first responders, as important as they definitely are. It's also our frontline workers. And I think we're fortunate to have you, Dr. Chelsea Harris, not only being a doctor and nurse practitioner, but also being a registered nurse and working in the academic system as well, which is a lot on your plate. I'd love to get your perspective, and if you have a question for any of our panelists.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and being in the nursing profession for almost 20 years now, and much of my research actually being in what is called the daily spiritual experience, which actually measures a sense of awe, as well as burnout and compassion fatigue, which are elements in the healthcare profession. And I do know with our brothers and sisters in law enforcement and some of those other first responders as well. And so I tend to lean towards the existential awe and the components of that, and that more positive kind of perception there. And so as I was listening to all of you speak, there's so much to take away today. But Dr., I believe it's Valdesolo, I hope I said that correctly. You mentioned about the supernatural versus the scientific. And in my own personal research and professional research, I've found that daily spiritual experience, which has that component of a sense of awe, has actually been supported as a protective mechanism against burnout and compassion fatigue, many of the things that we as healthcare providers experience in our day-to-day. And so you mentioned about that in your research, that awe often would increase theists' beliefs in religion as an explanatory framework, and that awe would decrease theist beliefs in science. And then you had this moment where you said the effect of awe on non-theist attitudes is a little less clear. And so you moved on to talk about defensive versus constructive, and that position of curiosity. And I'm wondering if we have a person who is in healthcare, or our first responders, or our police officers, why should we desire to move someone toward a more constructive position, or any position, if they're already in a healthy state of awe, if per se they're in the supernatural or existential form of awe? I'd just like for you to speak a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. Yeah, I try to be very careful whenever I describe my research or my results, not to suggest that one direction or another is a more desirable outcome, right? So as a psychologist, I really try to say, here's what we found, here's what happens with this psychological profile and this psychological variable, not to say, and that's good, and this is what we should want. So to the extent that the kind of openness and curiosity and more exploratory position is something that we want, then under those circumstances, if that's what we want, then I think regardless of what your initial explanation is, whether it's theistic or not, moving people away from what I would call their default explanations is what you're going to want to do. So I didn't mean to imply that the desirable outcome is one way or another. I think that for any individual, any practitioner, they need to decide, okay, what is best for me? What is best for my patient, given my knowledge, my expertise, the context that I'm in, and then use this science to guide your choices. if you believe that for you or your patient in your context, moving away from how they tend to explain the world will be better for them or for you, then by all means, foster the kind of constructive awe that Dr. Schneider and I were discussing. But if not, then you might not want to do that.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, so I've been a crisis negotiator for quite some time, and part of our duties are when we engage with people is that when they are in a high state of crisis, and it's usually involving a threat to life, usually their own, maybe into somebody else as well. And here we are, we have to talk to them and connect to them. And we find that it's been mentioned a few times, is about being in the moment. Being able to connect with that individual and maybe getting a perspective, not necessarily on positions, but as in interests of where we are, and finding out more about the individual who is, as I said, in a state of crisis, maybe looking in the past, maybe looking in the future, but it's important to ground them and have an understanding. And Dr. Bonner, you mentioned a little bit earlier how the feeling of connectedness was an important aspect in getting into awe. And I just wonder if you could explain just a little bit more about that. Would it be more of a connectedness amongst members that are known to each other? Or is it something that could be precipitated in a quick fashion as maybe as a crisis negotiator connecting with an individual over a short period of time?
I think absolutely. As in your role as crisis negotiator, there are a lot of things that you can do to use that instant kind of rapport, those instant rapport kind of techniques, and that also take the person out of wherever they're wrapped up into, like this future that they can't possibly look at, this past that's so painful. When you just say, look at that, just look at that, like right there, like those kinds of things, like you and I are having. Isn't it interesting how there's an echo in this alleyway? If they're smoking a cigarette, isn't it interesting how the smoke kind of like winds up and until it hits a certain point in the air and then disperses out. Having those kind of instant, I think, experiences of just like noticing whatever and drawing the other person's attention to it, just to say like that's an interesting thing that you have that you're wearing there, or isn't that an interesting how that shadow on the wall is. I think there are things that we can always be awed about. And I think we can draw other people's attention to what those things are. And I think in a situation like that, where you are sitting down with a person who's in an intense kind of situation, doing something like that, I think also it connects with them. And I saw that and to some degree, I think diffuses the situation. You're talking about something that's really profound, but you can talk about it in such a way that takes out some of the heightenednesses. Isn't it really cool how the cigarette, the smoke from your cigarette is kind of like twirling in the air there, and then you're just having a human moment-to-moment connection with the person, and having that kind of that I thou kind of experience, which is critical for moving the person whatever direction that you want to move them to. And in your situation, you want to move them to a place where they're in more safety and the public's more safety and things like that. But I think any opportunity for pointing out like isn't this a cool experience, isn't that a wow kind of moment, which it seems kind of like, wow, the person's on the edge of their seat, they're already there, they're already experiencing some wow on a physiological level. So if you can replace whatever it is that's distressing them with something in the moment that you alongside of them can experience as a wow kind of moment, I think it helps develop that instant rapport, takes them out of the moment kind of, and distresses the situation. So I'm not an expert in that area. I find NLP and all that fascinating work, but I would absolutely suggest that if you see an opportunity to utilize awe or any trigger for awe in those situations, by all means, I think it could be a great.